half of our conversation that was begun last month about our legislative priorities. And at that meeting, it was clear that there's a lot of us who would like to learn more about how to be more effective in terms of changing state policy and how can we actually make a bill that we care about become law? What can we do? And so we have invited one of the best organizations in the state at doing this work, Mass Public Health Association, here to give us a training. So I've been working with MPHA for years, as I'm sure many of you have, and just so appreciate their deep knowledge about how to be effective in the State House. And so I'm really grateful to Alexis Walls, who's the assistant campaign director at MPHA and comes to that work from a history of youth substance use prevention, to come and just educate us about what we need to know to be effective. And so we're gonna hear from Alexis, and she has a bunch of stuff to present, and we'll take any questions and answers at different spots during the meeting, and then we'll talk a little more about how to use the My Legislature function at the state website. And then if we have time, we will talk about sort of concrete next steps that we can take, both in terms of the CHIP legislative priorities, which were contributed by many of you, the actual bills and special commissions we want to follow the work of. And if anybody came to this meeting today because they have also something they would like to add to that, that they would like to sort of pitch that people know about and work on, there'll be time at the end for you to do that. And you could chat me in the chat. If you can private chat me and say, like, I would like a minute or two to talk about a particular priority at the end, then I'm happy to, make room for that. So without further ado, turning it over to Alexis from MPHA. Welcome out to Western Mass, even though you're not really here.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. It's good to see your faces. As Phoebe said, my name is Alexis Walls, and I work with the Massachusetts Public Health Association. And my role as Assistant Campaign Director, I think of it in three ways. So a lot of the work that I do is keeping up with our community partners in different parts of the state to ensure that our policy priorities are reflecting what you all are seeing on the ground. I do a lot of work like this in thinking about capacity building and building up your advocacy muscles. And I also lead up a lot of our transportation work. So hi, Kim. Good to see you. I help co-chair our RTA Advocates Coalition with Enrique Pepin from T for Mass. So it's really good to see all of you here today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and would love a thumbs up if you all can see what's on my screen. All right, wonderful. Give me a quick second to make this.
Still seeing the sidebar. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Alrighty, so we're here today to talk about legislative advocacy. So really excited to dive in with you all. Phoebe and Jen have shared that you all have, quite a few pieces of legislation that are on your priority list for this legislative session. And so something like this would be really helpful. And so please, I want you all to get out of this what is useful. And so if you have any questions, especially clarifying questions about what's on the slide, please feel free to type it in the chat. I know Jen is going to be keeping an eye on it and will stop me at any time to ask any questions. I will also say that from looking at the questionnaires that you all filled out before attending this meeting, that we have a wide range of experiences with the legislature. Some folks who are super familiar and others who are not so familiar. And that's okay, right? If you do not have a lot of experience and you have a lot of questions, please feel free to ask them. But I would also say for those who do have a lot of experience on this topic, if there are any tips that you have that you want to share, or you want to share any of your expertise that can help to bolster what we're talking about today, please feel free to jump in and do that. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So just, I want to give a quick overview of what our learning objectives are today, and then, what are the pieces that we're going to sort of dive into. And the two big things that I would love for you all to walk away with is the ability to describe the process of how policy is passed in Massachusetts, and when there is actually opportunity for advocates to get involved. So that's really important. Another piece is identifying strategies for engaging with state policymakers. So we are going to talk a bit about that. And this will sort of be broken into three parts. We'll first talk about the legislative structure. We'll talk about legislative process, and then also how you actually engage with the legislature. So I'm going to present this framework because it's something that my colleague, Andrea Freeman, who some of you may be familiar with, has used in the past, and I think it's really effective. And that is effective public health advocates. They do 5 things in order to have an impact, right? They get the right information to the right people at the right time using the right method, and they have that message come from the right messenger. So today we're going to focus really on 2 through 4. We're not going to talk as much about 1 and 5, but I will say in order to get the right information, which really, because we're talking about legislative advocacy, that would mean getting the right bill numbers, the right amendment numbers, knowing when hearings are taking place, all of that information you can find using the Massachusetts legislature's website. And there is a 1-pager that we've provided that Jen can pop the link to in the chat that provides information on how to navigate that website. So if you're thinking about, well, how do I get the right information, or, where do I find that information? That is where you can find it. And that 1-pager should be able to help you out with that. I believe Jen is also going to walk you through how to use that at the end of this meeting. And then the last piece around who's the messenger. Well, in this case, you all are the messenger, right? So we know who the messenger is. So we're not going to spend as much time on that, but we are going to talk about the numbers 2 through 4. All right. So in thinking about the right people, who are the right people to direct our message to, I'm going to take us back a little bit. And we're just going to talk about what the legislature does, like why is it important for us to be involved, and how is it set up? Okay. So I would love to hear from you all, and you can either pop your answer in the chat or you could take yourself off mute and chime in. But why do you see the legislature as important? What are some of the things that our legislators do? And I'll give you all a moment to respond. Set the budget, absolutely. They determine how our state revenue is being spent. Yep. Budget. I know the budget's on everyone's mind because we're in budget season right now. Any other ideas on what the legislature does and why it's important? Change laws. Absolutely. Yeah, they represent us. Absolutely. We elect them in office and they represent us. Yeah, dedicate funding to issues that are pertinent to community members. They file bills. Absolutely. So you all are right on the money. All of those things are the responsibility of our legislature. So I'm just going to give us a slightly more fleshed out list. So as you all have identified, the legislature discusses and votes on proposed laws. They approve the state budget. They establish the courts. They have oversight over state agencies. So some of you may remember a couple of months ago, I think it was, when we were having a lot of conversations around what does it look like to center equity in our vaccine distribution and rollout. There were legislative oversight hearings that our legislators held in trying to hold the executive office or the executive branch accountable, right? So they do have some oversight over state agencies. They are able to override the governor's veto with the 2/3 vote, and they also perform services for their constituents. So some of you may not have interacted with your legislator because you're trying to get them to pass a specific policy, but maybe it's because there's something that they can do for you in your local community, and you've leveraged the relationship in that way. So our legislature, as you can see, has a really broad scope, and they do a lot that shapes the environment and the world that we see around us. So it's pretty important. They hold a lot of responsibility and power, and that's why it's important for us as advocates and folks who care about public health to be working to influence the legislature. Okay. So what we're going to do next is we are going to answer a few questions. So as I said, because we have a wide range of experience with the legislature here, I'm going to take us back a little bit, and we're just going to think about the structure of the legislature and what the basic rhythms of the legislature is. So what you're going to see in a bit is you are going to see a poll that comes up that has 4 questions, and you all are going to take some time to answer those questions. We'll see how folks respond, and then we're going to review the answers to these. And no pressure at all. You know, this is stuff that, I mean, some of us may have learned if you grew up in Massachusetts when you were in school, but if you don't have regular interaction with the legislature, it's totally understandable if you don't know the answer to all of these. So no pressure at all, but let's try to give it our best go and answer them. So I'm going to launch the poll, and would love a thumbs up if you all can see these questions. Can you all see these okay? Wonderful. All right. So the first question is, how many state representatives do we have in Massachusetts? And you can answer these all sort of in one go. We don't have to go one at a time, but I'll just sort of read them all out. How many state reps do we have in Massachusetts? How many state senators do we have in Massachusetts? How long is the legislator's term in Massachusetts? And then lastly, how often do Massachusetts legislators meet? All right, so you all can go ahead and start answering. I'll give a few minutes for that. I'll give maybe 1 more minute for folks to answer the questions. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and review? So I can see that for the question about how many step reps we have in Mass, most people answered about 185. I can see that for state senators, we're sort of split between 40 and 80. I can see that when we think about how long a term is, most people have said 2 years. And then how often do legislators meet? Most people have said that they meet year round in 2-year sessions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the polling here. And you can see how most folks responded to these questions here. And we're actually going to review the answers. And I will say, actually, as a whole, you all were right on the money for a couple of these. So you were absolutely right on about the length of the legislator's term and how often legislators meet. But let's kind of take a step back and review. Okay, so in breaking this down, we actually have 160 state representatives in Massachusetts. So that's 1 state rep per 40,000 constituents. We have 40 state senators in Massachusetts. That's 1 per 160,000. A legislator's term is 2 years, but I will say, as you all probably know, many legislators run for re-election, right? And it's also important to note that our elections in both the primary and also the general elections are not super competitive. So it's oftentimes that legislators run unopposed in their roles. So even though the term is 2 years, many end up serving longer than that. And then lastly, our legislators meet year round. So Massachusetts is unique in that we are one of, and I forget how many states it is, I want to say 10, but please do not quote me on that. But we are one of few states who have full-time legislators, which as advocates, this is great news because it means that we have year round to be building up our relationships with legislators. And just as a note, our current session, so the legislative session typically begins in an odd numbered year. And so our session began January 2021 and will go until December of 2022. Do you have any questions about this before we go on to the next piece? I want to make sure if there are any clarifying questions folks have, that we answer those as we go.
I have 2.
Sure.
If nobody else has any. One question that I have is, are there term limits for Massachusetts legislators?
So there's
Like,
not.
I mean, like, can they serve indefinitely for like until they decide they don't want to do it anymore?
To my knowledge, that's a really good question. To my knowledge, they can serve as long as they want to. So there are legislators who may have be in a seat for a really long time. So there isn't that the term limit is 2 years. As far as like the length of the term, but I do not think there is a limit to how long a legislator can serve. But I will also follow up on that, and if the answer is different from what I've said, I will follow up with you on that.
There aren't.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Phoebe.
I'm also curious about, if this is a year-round full-time job, do our legislators get paid a sort of full-time salary for doing their work?
Great. That's a great question. So the salary of, I think the average salary for legislators in Massachusetts is about 65 or 67, somewhere in there. And I think it also depends as well on a legislator's expertise and how long they've been serving. But in Massachusetts, I want to say that it's between 65 and 67. And let me actually, I have that figure that I can go and double check here. Just to make sure that I give you the exact.
And they get more if they're a committee chair.
Yep, absolutely. Depending on how much responsibility and your leadership, you get more money. Thanks, Phoebe. Let me just confirm this here. 63,000 annual base salary for legislators in Massachusetts. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So let's move into this next piece, which is who holds the power. So we like to include this because it's important to remember that while all legislators have a vote, there is a core group of legislators who make decisions around what is actually brought to a vote. So there are some who hold more power than others, and this power looks different, right? So there are formal leadership positions, and there are also informal leadership positions. And so for the House, some of our top dogs in the House include the Speaker of the House and our House Majority Leader. We also have our House Chair of Ways and Means. And for those who don't know, Ways and Means committees are those that make a lot of decisions that shape how money is actually being spent in the state. So it's a pretty big responsibility, a pretty big role. And in the Senate, sort of mirroring that, we have the Senate President, Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Ways and Means chairs. And so we have those sort of formal positions of power. And we also have committee chairs. So within the legislature, power is often delegated through committees. And there are committees for several different subject areas. So we have committees for public health, for housing, for transportation. And these committees are responsible for reviewing legislation specific to their subject area and determining whether that legislation should be reported favorably or not. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But our committee chairs also hold a lot of power. And so when we talk about, who it is that we're targeting our message towards, we never want to think about the legislature as a whole, right? Because the legislature as a whole is very diverse. But when we think about targeting our message towards decision makers who have the power to give us what we want to be as specific as possible. And so when you all are thinking about the legislation that you're supporting, you want to be thinking about who has the most power in any given situation. So if we're thinking about a hearing that's coming up for a bill on local public health, for example, the targets perhaps might be the chairs of our public health committee, right? Whereas if we're talking about the budget, the budget season, which we're coming out of right now, if we're talking about the budget, the Ways and Means chairs are going to be the ones that are holding the most power. And that's where we might want to be directing a lot of our advocacy and a lot of our focus. And so the reason I include this photo from Mean Girls, which some of you might recognize, is because, and this is something I know Andrea, kind of an analogy that she uses, but when we think about the legislature, just like in school, there are always the popular kids, right? So we can think about some of our leaders in formal positions as the popular kids. I also want to note, though, that there are some legislators who may not hold a formal position of power, but who may have relationships that are really close with people who are in formal positions of power, which therefore means they have power. And so it isn't always super clear how that works. And I just want to say, lastly, the other power structure that we haven't talked about yet is you as the constituent. You all hold a lot of power. As we've mentioned earlier, your legislators are accountable to you. You elect them into office. And so they are inclined to listen to constituents. And it's also important to note that even though our legislators are full-time and serve year-round, they and their staff do not have the capacity to become experts in every single issue, right? And so you may know a lot about transportation, or you may know a lot about local public health or substance use, or whatever it is. You may know a lot about a certain issue area that your legislators honestly don't have a whole lot of information on. And so they're relying on you to build a relationship and share that information so that they can use it to make solid policy decisions. Are there any questions that we have about this here and thinking about power within the legislature? And thank you for chiming in with that, Phoebe. Yeah, important, important representatives who might be in your district, your legislators rather. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions there, we're going to move into this next piece, which is thinking about legislative processes, or in other words, thinking about the right time. So we've talked about where you can get the right information. We've talked about, MyLegislature.gov, and you've gotten the one pager for that, and Jen will walk you through that. We've talked about the who, right? So who it is that has power and who you might be directing your messaging towards. And now we're going to talk about the timing. And in order to talk about timing, we're going to think about two processes, one being the state budget process and the other being the typical process in which bills become laws in Massachusetts.
Alexis?
Yes.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Absolutely.
I realize since you summed it up like that, it made me jogged my memory that I wanted to say that another thing in terms of the who is that the committee that is seeing a bill that you're interested in has a staff. So in terms of the who, another place to start is whoever is the staff person to that committee, and they stick around from legislative chair to legislative chair, and they know their stuff. So also a really good place to start when you're asking about a particular issue.
That's great, Phoebe. Thanks for chiming in with that. And if anyone else, like I said, there's a lot of expertise that's within this room. So if anyone else has anything else to add as we keep going, please feel free to take yourself off of mute and contribute. Okay. So let's talk about process. And first, we're going to talk about the state budget. And the reason we're going to talk about the budget is because the budget is one of the most important bills that's passed in our legislature every year, right? So we have legislative sessions every 2 years. The budget is passed annually. And it's important because this determines how much money is being allocated to different agencies and departments. And the bills that we want passed and the policy change that we want to see happen oftentimes doesn't have teeth unless it's attached to money, right? And so our state budget process is really important. And as I mentioned earlier, we are in the midst of our budget process right now in Massachusetts. And so this is sort of giving a general overview that I'll walk through, and then I have more specific slides that'll talk a little bit more about where advocates can be the most powerful in this process. So our state budget is the process begins in December, right? So even though right now we're in the middle of the Senate process, the process started in December. It started way before then, when the governor and legislative leaders come together and they agree on what the estimated revenue is going to be for the state in the coming fiscal year. So they make that estimate in December, and that's published. And then the governor comes in at the beginning of the year in January and releases a budget proposal for the state. After the governor does that in January, We then fast forward to April, where the House Committee on Ways and Means, and again, remember the committees on Ways and Means are the ones who have a lot of power in shaping how money's being spent within the state. The House Committee on Ways and Means will then release their budget in mid-April, and the House will sort of go through the debate process and finalize their budget in April. At the beginning of May, or actually mid-May rather, Senate Ways and Means will do something similar. So the Senate Ways and Means Committee releases their draft budget, and then all senators have an opportunity to sort of contribute to that and debate it. And then the Senate will pass its final budget. In Massachusetts, the Senate just passed its final budget last week, actually. So we're just coming out of that process. Then in June, which is where we are right now, we move into conference committee. And conference committee is where differences between the House budget and the Senate budget are resolved. So we have conferees from both the House and the Senate who come together and sort of duke this out. And then after that, the budget goes to the governor's desk, and the governor has the opportunity to veto the budget. He has the opportunity to veto specific line items in the budget. And then it goes back to the legislature, who has the opportunity to override any of those vetoes if they wish. That requires a 2/3 majority. And then finally, the budget is passed and goes into effect July 1. And just to note, many of you may be familiar with the rhythms of the state budget, but the budget runs from July 1 to June 30 of every year. So then diving in a little bit deeper and looking more closely and thinking about where advocates can be powerful. So this is going back to the House process, right? So we have the governor releasing his budget in January. We have House Ways and Means releasing their budget in April. And then is the fun part, because that's when legislators have an opportunity, or specifically House representatives, since we're talking about the House process right now, House representatives have an opportunity to file amendments, which include changes that they want to see to the budget. And usually there are over 1,000 amendments. So there are tons of amendments that are filed to the budget. And the reason I've starred this specific step, because this is a place where advocates can have a lot of power. Because as I mentioned earlier, it is legislators and their staff who depend on constituents to better understand what's going on and what's needed, right? And so let's say, for example, one of our priorities at MPHA is thinking about local public health and how to strengthen our local public health system in the state. If we know or we expect that the budget is not going to have the amount of money that we're looking for, we're going to be reaching out to legislators that we partner with on those issues and ask them in advance if they can file an amendment, and we'll work out the language so that by the time the amendment process comes around, they're ready to file. So that's one space where advocates can be really active. Another that's probably even more accessible for most folks is the co-sponsorship process. So once those amendments are filed, representatives have an opportunity to co-sponsor amendments that have been filed by their colleagues. This is important because the more co-sponsors an amendment has, the more support is shown for that amendment, and the more likely it is to be adopted into the final budget. After that, the budget is debated, and the House votes on a final version of their budget before it moves on to the Senate. And the Senate process honestly looks very similar to the House. So again, we have Senate Ways and Means who's releasing their budget. They have a deadline as well for amendments to be filed, and they're usually fewer in the Senate than in the House, which makes a lot of sense. Again, thinking about how many senators we have versus how many House reps we have. We then have an opportunity for senators to co-sponsor amendments, which again is another key time for advocates to be active. And then the Senate budget is debated. Following that, we have conference committee, which we talked about earlier in June, where the conferees reconcile the House and Senate versions of the bill. This is yet another opportunity for advocates to be active. So if you all have been keeping up with any specific amendments to the budget, and you know that, for example, I'll give an example for some of the work that we're doing. As I mentioned earlier, we at MPHA helped to lead the Regional Transit Authority Advocates Coalition, and there were amendments that we were successful in getting filed and adopted in the House budget, but that same thing did not happen for the Senate. And so we know for conference committee advocates, we have to be mobilizing advocates and asking for advocates to contact their legislators or contact conferees and ask for conferees to pass the House version of the RTA budget. Does that make sense to folks? So that's sort of another space for folks to be active. And then after that, the House and Senate vote on the budgets. The governor has 10 days to sign or veto the budget. And then the House and Senate, as I mentioned before, have the power to and often do override vetoes that the governor makes. So I'm going to pause there before we go into this next process and see if there are any questions that folks have. Okay. Alrighty. So we have an activity coming up next. So we just talked through the budget process for Massachusetts, but now we're going to zoom out and think about the process with which bills become law in the state. And this, I will say, doesn't get into the nitty gritty. It doesn't cover every single piece of the process. It's more of a high level overview. But what you're going to do is you're going to see in a bit a slide that has 8 Post-it notes with a different step of the bill process on each Post-it note. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to help rearrange the Post-its so that they are in order, so that they're in chronological order. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here. And I am going to share my Google slide where we actually have the power to sort of move in and move some of these Post-its along. So tell me if you all can see my Google slide. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Alrighty. So you can see here on the Google slide, as I mentioned, we have 8 steps that are on Post-it notes. These are all in random order. And I would love your help thinking about what should go where. I think the first one is pretty obvious, but can you all tell me, and feel free to take yourself off of mute, what do you think goes first in this process?
Session begins.
Yes, absolutely. Session begins. So I'm going to move this over here. We have our session beginning. Absolutely. All right. So after the session begins, what do you all think happens next?
Co-sponsors, legislators co-sponsor bills.
Okay, so we're thinking legislators co-sponsor bills. Okay. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about what could come next?
5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed.
Okay. 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed. Tim, how do
Either
you
that or hearings are held.
Committee assignments?
Yeah.
Committee assignments.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move this here. I'm going to move this one up here. 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed. Because I think to the piece that Tim mentioned about legislators co-sponsoring bills, I think we have to get our bills filed first. So now that our bills are filed, what do you all think comes next?
Leadership moves favorable bills along.
Okay. So we have leadership moves favorable bills along. Also, I'm not confirming that any order is correct or not yet. I'm just kind of getting us to play around with this a little bit and come to an agreement as a group.
I think Tim's suggestion of the co-sponsorship.
Okay. Does anyone else agree with that being next, the co-sponsorship? Can I see maybe like thumbs up?
I'm thinking bills are divided into committees.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Does anyone else agree with that? So we have 2 options right now that seem popular. We have legislators co-sponsor bills as a next option, or Tim, did you say bills are divided into committees?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I agree with Tim.
Okay.
So I think that the committee assignments are second.
Yeah, I think the committee assignments after the session begins, they need to be assigned to committees.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
Not the bills, the representatives and senators need to know which committee they're on, right?
Okay.
And then the bills get divided into those committees.
Okay. So we're saying this comes next, and then we're also saying then the bills are filed. Then folks are saying
No. Oh,
is that what
they're
you were saying?
co-sponsored?
no, I would say the bills get divided into committees first.
Before they're filed?
No,
Oh, no,
she
you're
means
right.
before they're co-sponsored.
You're right. You're right.
Okay, so we feel good about these four. Is this what so session begins, reps and senators are assigned to committees, 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed, bills are divided into committees. Does the full group feel, most people feel okay with that? Yes, no, maybe? Yeah, iffy. Okay, well, you know what? Let's keep moving and we'll take another look at it when we're finished. How about that? What do you all think then comes next after that?
Hearings.
Co-sponsors first.
Okay, does anyone agree with Phoebe that our co-sponsors should come before hearings?
Mhm.
Okay, alrighty.
Although that changes, sometimes the rules change about how long it takes for co-sponsorship. Like this year, you can co-sponsor for way longer than you used to be able to.
That's a great point. That's a great point. How about we think of it not as the end point of co-sponsorship, but when co-sponsorship is first initiated, that process is sort of
Okay.
Okay.
That's a good point. Okay. What about next? What comes after the hearings, do you all think?
Leadership moves favorable bills along.
Okay. Right. Switch these two.
Whatever that means.
It can't vote it on the floor unless the leadership has moved it along, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I want to know more about that. Leadership moves favorable bills along. Like,
Yeah,
it feels like the
me too.
leadership has an awful lot of power.
Yeah, and I will say this, the actual process is so, it involves like multiple readings of bills. It goes to various different committees. But the reason we flag leadership moves favorable bills along is because going back to the point we mentioned before about the core powership structure, if leadership does not want a bill to move forward, a bill will not be moved forward for a floor vote. And that's just the way that it is. Leadership has a lot of power in determining what gets to the floor or what doesn't. And oftentimes once a bill is on the floor, unless it's something that's incredibly controversial or just really contentious, leadership often knows where the votes are, right? They know how folks are going to vote. So you would be right. Leadership does hold a lot of power. But I would even say like the intricacies of sort of what happens between, a hearing perhaps being, or a committee providing a report and of the floor vote actually taking place. A lot of that is sort of behind closed doors, that process, and it's often moved by leadership. Okay. So do folks feel good about this order? Is this our final answer? Were you like pressing the button? I don't know what button I'm pressing here, but yeah. Okay. So I would say that we have some of these on the money, and then there are others that we would probably need to tweak a little bit. So I'm actually, what we're going to do is I'm going to review it in this slide here. And then we'll sort of go back and kind of move some stars around and move our bills around. So what actually will happen is, you all are right, the session will begin and bills are filed, right? So I think here we said reps and sens are assigned to committees before bills are being filed, but actually it's the bills that are filed before we even know who is on what committee.
Wow.
Okay? So that actually comes next. And actually, before any committee assignments are made, co-sponsorships are actually opened. The floor is open for co-sponsorships. So we have our co-sponsorships that happen next. And then even before our reps and senators are assigned to committees, we have bills that are divided into committees. And then we have our reps and senators assigned to committees. And some of this kind of like happens simultaneously. It kind of happens around the same time. Then you all are absolutely right that we have hearings. We have hearings that are held. And during those hearings, this is really important for advocates because this provides advocates an opportunity to essentially tell a story, to craft a story around why a bill is important. They are able to provide testimony. You get perspectives from advocates, from folks who are maybe more directly related or associated with the industry itself that's being discussed. But all of that sort of happens during hearing. And then usually after that hearing, a couple things could happen. The committee could determine that more information is needed. and that, you know, maybe like a special committee needs to be set up to investigate further. But oftentimes after hearing, what'll happen is the committee that is assigned that bill will provide either a favorable or an unfavorable report of the bill. And if the bill is reported favorably, leadership will then take the next step in moving that favorable bill. If it's one that they, you know, support, they will take the next steps in moving that bill along. And then finally, we will have floor votes that take place. And so I'm going to pause there to see if we have any questions. I see someone asked a question in the chat, and Phoebe responded with leadership. You're absolutely right. That is who's making the decision on who goes into what committee, especially thinking about our Speaker of the House and our Senate President. They hold the most power within either chamber. So they're often at the helm in deciding who's in what leadership role and who's going to what committee. But what I would love for us to do is to then think about, especially given what we've learned from the budget process, where do you think advocates might have the most power in this specific process? I have stars here, and I'm going to drag them where you all think they should be dragged. So are there any of these steps in the process where you think advocates would be the most effective?
Co-sponsoring the bills.
Okay, absolutely. So we have co-sponsoring bills. Yep.
The hearings.
Yeah, absolutely. The hearings. Absolutely. And the funny thing about hearings too is that it's hard to predict when they'll actually take place. So for example, for a lot of our transportation work right now, we worked with a legislator to file a bill specific to RTAs, moving forward some policies that we've been wanting for a long time. And we don't know when our hearing might take place, if we'll get one at all. The hearing could come up in 2 weeks. It could be in 3 months from now, but we honestly don't know. So we have to pay close attention to thinking about when the hearing might be held. But that's absolutely a place for advocates to be active, and honestly for advocates to even plan in advance. So even if we don't know the exact date of a hearing, to be getting together speaker panels and determining how we want to tell our story, all of that is work that advocates can be doing even without a hearing date.
Also I wanted to back up what Lizzie was saying about the co-sponsorship, because this is a really great way to signal to leadership the support a particular bill has. And so, for instance, I've been working for years on this effort to try to kind of get Massachusetts's local public health system up to snuff, and getting the state to invest in it. And the difference now after a crisis like this, the difference between asking someone to co-sponsor and having them do it, 10 years ago and now is just dramatic. We had something like 120, co-sponsors to the bill, and that makes a huge difference in signaling how it should go, whether it should get a hearing and how soon, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Phoebe.
I'm looking at the step of the reps and the senators being assigned to committee.
Yes.
And the point, I was wondering about it until the point you made, we're not sure who they're going to be, but we know there will be committees.
Yes, yes. So oftentimes a lot of the committees are pretty standard and are standing. So something like the Joint Committee on Public Health, Transportation Committee, those are pretty standard, and we can expect those year to year. So even if we don't know who specifically will be in the leadership role within that committee, we know that the committee will exist. Something though that is different sometimes from year to year is thinking about new committees that are created. So I think this legislative session, there was a committee that was created specific to COVID-19 and our recovery from COVID-19. I think there was a committee that was created specific to racial justice, I want to say. So sometimes as issues become really prominent, a new committee might be created in order to support the bills that will come from that priority issue. So yeah, that's a good thing to flag. Thanks.
I think
And-
another place that we have good influence is right after the session begins and before the bills are filed, especially if we have an idea of one of those, gee, why didn't I think of that kind of things? Because the bills have to be written, so they need to have an idea of what to write for a bill.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm trying to put the star there, but for some reason it's being a little wonky. But yes, 100%. That is absolutely another time where advocates can be really active in getting bills filed. And honestly, advocates do a lot of the work in writing the bills that are often filed. So you'll often see bills that are filed that advocates themselves have worked with staff to draft. And so it's really, that's often where a bill is coming from. It's from people who care about the issue on the ground and who are partnering with their legislator and their staff to actually draft the piece of legislation. So that's great. And I will just flag as well, the reason we don't often put a star down here. So when we think about a floor vote, right? Even if we know that a vote's taking place, are folks able to reach out to their legislators? Absolutely. But if we're talking about where advocates have the most power and when their work is going to have the most impact, it's oftentimes before, again, is a vote is even being held. Because as this process goes on, the narrative around a bill is being crafted, right? And so advocates want to be involved as early in the process as possible in helping to shape the narrative around that piece of legislation. So I'm looking at time, and I do have some other things I want us to get to. So I'm going to move on from this piece here and move us into the piece around engagement. And I want to talk about this specifically. And sorry, I'm going to actually switch back to my PowerPoint slides. Give me a quick second. And do full screen. Okay. Going past here, because something someone just said really resonates, which is thinking about when, right? Like when should advocates be engaged? When should they be involved? And someone mentioned, well, we want to make sure that our representatives know what they should be filing in the first place. And that's absolutely true. And I would even go as far as to say, yes, you know, being engaged throughout the different processes that we just talked through is great, but really, given the fact that we have full-time legislators, we should be actively engaging legislators year round, right? Not just when we want them to do something, because how much more powerful or how much more power do you think you'll hold in communicating with your legislator or their staff once you've already have a relationship built, as opposed to just contacting them about co-sponsoring a specific amendment or bill, right? So year round is when advocates really should be building these relationships out, because we can, and because that is the most strategic way to build a relationship. And
Alexis, we're still seeing, by the way, the first slide in case you are thinking you're showing us the legislative engagement slide.
Oh, oops. Okay, that is not what I wanted you to see. Wait a quick second. Let's see here. Okay. What about?
Isn't Zoom fun?
Oh, great. So great. Okay, what about
There we go.
now? Okay, perfect. Thanks for flagging that, Phoebe.
You're welcome.
So yeah, so advocates really should be engaging. A couple of tips on how to do this well. So one is you actually have more power if you are registered to vote and you can access that information. And I don't know about you, but if I'm a legislator and I'm listening to a constituent.
Alexis, now you're freezing up. Is she freezing up only for me?
No.
No, she's freezing up.
Whoa, she's gone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay, I don't know what's happening with
you might want to turn off your camera,
Okay,
but just share your screen.
okay.
The
let me-
sharing screen went away.
Okay, what
we
about now? Can you all see this on screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Keep talking.
There
to
we go. Perfect.
Thing happens. All right, perfect. So as I said, you have more power if you're registered to vote and if you voted in recent elections. It's important to remember as well that stories are stickier than data. So when you're approaching a legislator and you want to tell them about an issue and you want to share with them why they should take action on something or why a specific solution is the right one, data is great, stats are great, but what stays with legislators the most are stories. That is something that will like really hit the heart as opposed to just the head. And it's something that they will be able to remember, grab onto, and they'll be able to share it with their colleagues when it's time for them to talk about this bill with colleagues. And so being sure to bring stories to the table is really important. It's also important, no matter how you're engaging with the legislator, to keep your discussion of the issue concise, because your interaction might be brief. And so you want to make the most of the time you have. Don't ignore the staff. Phoebe referenced this earlier, but staff are so important. Staff are often the ones determining how a legislator should spend their time, what their position on a specific policy should be. Staff are very important. And so just as you're wanting to build relationships with the legislators themselves, that's great. You also want to be building relationships with staff. And then lastly, follow up with a thank you note. If you've asked your legislator to take action and they follow through with it, whether you were successful or not in the outcome, the fact that they took action or the fact that they heard you or met with you is really important to follow up with a thank you. They don't get them often, and it really goes a long way in building that rapport and building that relationship, which of course then builds your influence as a constituent and as an advocate. And then these are just sort of key ingredients to any interaction with the legislator. We want legislators to be aware of a problem, but we also want to talk more about solutions than the actual problem itself. So for example, I'll pick the issue of local public health, because again, that's one that that we've been working with. I know Phoebe and others on. Our local public health system is incredibly decentralized and fragmented, and local public health is funded differently across the state, which means that some of our residents have protections that are great and others not so great, right? And so that's a problem. And I definitely want to make sure a legislator is aware of that problem, but what I want to make sure even more that they're aware of are some of the solutions, right? We want to make sure that we're implementing better standards across our local public health boards. We want to make sure that we are providing better funding for local public health. We want to make sure that we make it easier for local boards of health to share some of their services across jurisdictions, right? And so I want to talk more about solutions than I'm just talking about the problem. I also want to make sure that I'm backing some of those solutions with stories and data, right? So we want to hit the head and the heart. And then lastly, but most importantly, you want to come in with a clear ask, whether it's you asking your legislator to co-sponsor an amendment, whether it's you asking your legislator to meet with your team to talk more about some of these issues, whatever it is, you want to make sure that there is a clear ask that you are bringing to your legislator and their staff. So remember those sort of key ingredients or secret weapons, whatever you want to call them. This is just really quick, some different options for how you might engage legislators. You can engage your legislators both publicly and privately. And so if you want to pressure a legislator more publicly, you might do that through something like an op-ed or a letter to the editor. You can tweet at them or engage them on social media, because many of them and their staff are active on socials. You might want to host a special event or a forum. We've talked about hearings and the ways that those can be really impactful. A legislative breakfast is a really low-key, informal way to ensure that legislators have a better understanding of what your organization does and how you impact the community, and give them a better chance to meet some of the people who might be involved in your coalition. And there are also private ways of engaging legislators. And by this, we mean meetings, whether they're in district or at the State House in Boston. We can engage them through phone calls, through email, through group sign-on letters. So there are different ways that you can engage your legislator. And when deciding which way might be the most effective, I would think very carefully about your relationship with the legislator, and what type of pressure you're trying to apply. Sometimes public can be great if you're wanting to get other advocates involved, or it could be great if you're wanting to publicly pressure a legislator, where there are other times where it might be most effective for you to be building out that relationship or making the ask in private. Okay. The last piece, I have a few slides about lobbying that I do want to cover. But before doing that, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions that folks have about what we covered, either around thinking about who the message should be targeting, the actual process itself and the timing, or lastly, in thinking about what method or how you're approaching a legislator. If there are any questions about that before we talk a bit about lobbying.
Alexis, I have a question. I think the situation that's kind of unique to us out here in Franklin County is that, we know our local legislators pretty well. They're quite easy to engage, and for the most part, they're quite wonderful. One of the things that we're often trying to do is to advocate effectively with legislators who don't represent us directly. And so I don't know if you have any ideas for strategies about how we could, for instance, get some of those people who are in leadership positions in the eastern part of the state to, should we work through our legislators? That's just, it's a continuing concern. We just don't have very many people representing us. And so they work very hard for us, but not as many people live here as live in other parts of the state.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, Jen. And I certainly have a response, but I would also say after I respond, if anyone else who has expertise in working with legislators wants to share any of your thoughts, please feel free to jump in as well. So one thought is just building out relationships with folks in some of those districts, right? A great example I'll use again that I'm really familiar with is thinking about transit and regional transit. We know Franklin County has had very unique challenges when it comes to transportation and, limited weekend service, if at all, right? And so, that is an issue that's very specific to Franklin County. But when folks from Franklin County are then partnering with others in RTA service areas across the state on that issue, who might want more robust weekend service, or who might have similar challenges, that is a way to sort of build relationships with folks who are within that legislator's district who might have a little bit more influence. So that's one piece. But I would say another thing is, again, keeping in mind the informal power dynamics that folks have. And the best way of getting at that is through talking to your legislator, right? So if you have a conversation with, like, let's say Rep. Blay about an issue, and you want to know, hey, Rep. Blay, like, who is it that we need to be targeting? And like, what are your recommendations for getting there? Rep. Blay may have some great recommendations for who else you should be targeting, or Rep. Blay may have, even though she may not be in the leadership position, she may have a relationship with someone who is in that leadership position, who has the power to give you what you want, and she might be able to sort of influence them. And so just remembering that even if a legislator isn't in a formal position of power and they're not your primary target, you may very well have within your district a legislator who is a secondary target who has influence over one of your primary targets. And so those are two things that I would recommend. And I don't know if there are any other suggestions that others might have.
Yes, my only other suggestion would be that that's sort of a function that these statewide advocacy groups are really good at serving. So this is what I look to MPHA to do, so if I'm on a meeting where we have a little group of us who are trying to get the SAFE bill to pass, this public health, local public health infrastructure bill. And so they've got contacts around the state, and we get together and we say, okay, who has someone in the Senate President's district? Oh, this guy lives next door to her kid. Okay, you're going to be the one to meet with the Senate President, and you're going to be the one, Phoebe, Senator Comerford, you're going to have the meeting with Senator Comerford, so that is a really, and there are groups like T4MA, the transportation people, there are all kinds of different advocacy groups that are working, who will have contacts that you can then use, and you might go with them to meet with that person because you're the rural voice, in that meeting.
Yeah. Thank you, Phoebe. That's great. Okay. So Phoebe, Jen, I know we're at 4:02. I don't know if it's okay to
No,
take.
go ahead, because I think people really want to understand more about lobbying and advocacy.
Okay. Okay, great. So let's talk about lobbying. And I will just say before getting into this, these are sort of general guidelines for how to think about this. I am not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. This is not me giving legal advice. Okay, so what about lobbying? The first question is why? Why would we want to advocate and lobby? Can anyone maybe just either take yourself off of mute and share, or maybe type something in the chat? Why would we even be interested in advocating or lobbying to create policy change?
My mind is spinning, and I'm just thinking of a hypothetical, just based on what we just talked about. For example, transportation. I know that here in Franklin County, there are lots of people who are seeing signs that people are hiring. And a lot of times they need hires for second and third shift, but the transportation doesn't bear, doesn't help that out. So is this a place where we might be able to say part of the advocacy is to say, economically, the state will be a lot better off having people in jobs that they can get to on the second and third shift. So let's up the transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Tim. Yes. What you just described is thinking about the various ways in which a policy has consequences for community, right? So we want to lobby in one way, I'm hearing you say, is because it helps us take issues like more robust transportation, and it helps us make it more nuanced and kind of like elevate or uplift some of the other concerns or some of the other perhaps benefits that could come from a policy, benefits that may not be super clear upon first glance at that policy. So yeah, that's great. That's
Okay.
great. Thanks, Kim, for sharing some of that information out about the pilot that's happening in Franklin County with the Career Center. Yes, Shannon, our experience gives us a point of view or knowledge that is often overlooked or unknown. Absolutely, absolutely. Who knows about these issues better than the folks who are on the ground, who are either impacted by them directly or who work directly with those who are impacted, right? And so this is an opportunity to sort of uplift that perspective. Other reasons we advocate and lobby, as it was already mentioned, elected officials need our eyes and our ears. Advocacy and lobbying impacts who gets what, when, and how. It creates dialogue, right? So even if, let's say, for example, this RTA bill that our coalition worked to file with legislators earlier this year, even if the bill isn't passed the first go around, that's okay because it creates a dialogue. Phoebe gave the example of the local health infrastructure bill that was filed and was reported favorably out of committee towards the end of last year, but we ran out of time and weren't able to actually get it to be brought to a floor vote. That's okay because dialogue was created, support was created, right? And so that's another consequence of lobbying, which is very positive. And then lastly, it has positive impacts on public health because it's getting folks who are impacted by issues to engage in some of these systems, and it helps in sharing some of the power. And so this is why we want to advocate and lobby. And I mention this because lobbying can often be seen as something that's scary, or this idea of like, oh, well, is this considered lobbying and can I, is something that will often hold people back from engaging in this process. But that's the last thing that we want to do as advocates, right? We want to lean in, we want to better understand, and we want to actually take action. And so I have just a few slides on this. One is just what is lobbying? And I just want to note that overall, when we think about lobbying, we're talking not just about educating a legislator, right? Because educating a legislator about an issue, that is advocacy. When we're lobbying, we're talking specifically about asking a legislator to take a specific action around specific legislation. So that is what we think of when we think of lobbying. And we often see that in two ways. One is direct lobbying. So that is specifically communicating with the legislator or their staff person and asking them providing an opinion on that legislation and asking them to take action on legislation. There's also grassroots lobbying, which is communicating to large groups of people, expressing a view on specific legislation and asking those people to take action by contacting their legislators. All right. So that's lobbying. And whether we can lobby depends on a lot of things. I think some of the biggest factors here are thinking about streams of funding and whether someone receives federal funding. Another big piece of this puzzle too is thinking about an organization's structure and sort of where they sit. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of general guidelines for thinking about who can lobby and what that looks like. And then I also have a couple of suggestions to offer up as an alternative, right? And so this I will also say is available if you check. I think it's another link that we sent out that is in sort of the larger link that Jen and Phoebe sent out earlier. There is a specific one pager that I know Jen already put in the chat that just kind of lays out the difference between what is lobbying, what is advocacy. And there's another document that's longer, that's specific to advocacy and lobbying in Massachusetts, specific to food policy councils, but I think it's really relevant here. If you all take a look at page 11 in that packet, you will find this chart. I've sort of adapted it a little bit, but you can find this chart there. So really, when we think about who can lobby and how do I know if I can lobby, oftentimes nonprofits are able to lobby. That lobbying, in order to protect the nonprofit's 501c3 status, has to be considered an insubstantial portion of their activities. I will say that if you work with an organization that does not hire a full-time lobbyist, it's probably an insubstantial portion of your activities. It's probably not enough to be considered to put a non-501c3 status in jeopardy. I would also say that for nonprofits in the state of Massachusetts, we often need to have people who register as lobbyists. And so that holds people back from wanting to take action because they're like, well, even if my group can lobby, right? If I lobby, do I have to register as a lobbyist? I don't want to do all of that. I'm not going to bother. It's important to note that in Massachusetts, you only need to register as a lobbyist if you engage in more than 25 hours of lobbying every 6 months. That's a lot of time, right? And most of you probably aren't lobbying that often, right? To be considered a lobbyist and to need to register. So oftentimes nonprofits, folks within nonprofits are able to lobby. But I will say, and I'll say this for all of these, always talk to other folks in your organization to see, because different organizations have different policies, regardless of whether or not it's legal. The other piece here that I think will be relevant for this group is thinking about governmental groups, so groups that are embedded in government. More often than not, especially thinking about the funding streams that come to government agencies, more often than not, folks in these agencies can't directly lobby, but they might be able to advise government officials, and often in these positions can't take a public stance for or against specific legislation. But again, it depends on the agency. So I would say, again, talk to other folks in your organization to get a better sense of what is possible and what isn't. And then lastly, the only other group I wanted to cover was thinking about grassroots groups. And a grassroots group is sort of like the freest of all, can take any desired political stance, don't have to report time or money spent on lobbying. So grassroots groups are often the most free when it comes to lobbying. Now, what happens if, let's say, you're in doubt and you're not exactly sure? There are a couple of things I would say. One, again, ask others in your organization, because different organizations may have different policies around lobbying. Another is education, right? Even if you're unable to ask a legislator to take specific action around specific legislation, you can still educate them on the impact of a policy. You can still educate them around an issue. You can still raise awareness in your community, right? So there's still work you can do there are no limits, right, on education. You can always educate. And then lastly, take action on your own time. That's huge. You, as a constituent, you can take action whenever you want, however much you want, and no one can say anything about it, right? So as a constituent, you are able to lobby to your heart's desire, to your heart's content. So as a constituent, When in doubt, if you don't think you are quite able to within your position in your organization, you can always use your personal phone, use your lunch break to call up that representatives and ask them to take action on an amendment, to call them up and ask them to file a specific bill. You can always do that on your own personal time. And I think that is, this is just last piece, thinking about questions to ask before taking action. And this is sort of just recapping everything that we've talked about so far. So you want to be considering who's your key decision maker, what is the ask, remember coming with a clear ask, when is the best time to make the ask? We talked about those different processes earlier, and when advocates might want to take action. Who is the strategic messenger? And then also, what is an effective method or format for approaching a legislator? And that is all that I have. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'm sorry that I went over.
That's okay. This is great. Thank you so much. This is just wonderful. And I love the slides and all the guidance. Does anybody have other questions for Alexis that you didn't ask yet? The next thing we wanted to do is show you how to have Jen show you how to use the state legislative page, which has some really cool tools in it.
Before I do that, Elizabeth had a question that is about sort of how do bills get written? And I think I'm curious about that too, to understand, I know there are a lot of different ways, but it's kind of astonishing to me that you could have 8,000 bills filed at the beginning of a legislative session. Like who does that? And where do those come from? And, is it actually realistic that a citizen could draft something for their legislator and have that be a bill that might actually become law? And I'm aware that sometimes there are a lot of bills filed about the same issue, and what ends up coming out of the legislature is different than what went in. It's like I've heard our rep Paul Mark describe it as making sausage, which seems like a pretty apt description.
Yeah, so many good questions. Really how a bill is written, the answer is it depends, right? So sometimes it's coming straight from advocates. So the example that I gave about thinking about the regional transit authorities and sort of the bill that we filed specific to RTAs in Massachusetts, that was a bill that our coalition worked on together. And we had somebody from T4 Mass. And this is why it's great to partner, to Phoebe's point, partnering with other organizations, because other organizations may have skills or resources or expertise that can be leveraged to do something like file a bill. So I personally know nothing about legal language, the legal language needed to actually write an effective bill. However, I might be partnered with someone at T4 Mass or with another organization that does. And so we'll sort of take the perspective and the desires of coalition members and then partner with someone who knows how to write a bill and work together on that. And once we had sort of like a bill outline or draft, we approached legislative champions that we already knew cared about the issue. And for this one specifically, it's Rep. Blay and Senator Chandler are the two legislators that we approached. They care about the issue already. We knew that they cared about the issue, and they expressed interest in working with us on it. And then from there, we went about actually editing. If they had any questions, they would ask. And then the bill is then filed after their staff are happy with it. So that's one way that it can happen. Sometimes though, legislators have like a passion for something and they're interested and they take the lead on filing themselves. So there are also bills that are filed in that way. In which case, advocates might be consulted, but a legislator and their staff may be the one that kind of come up with the idea and who take the lead in crafting it. And so to your question about can, any constituent just kind of pick up and write a bill? In theory, yes, kind of, but not, but you need the expertise of someone who knows how to write a bill, who understands the law already, right? And can think about how a bill might fit into the rest, like other general laws. And so I would say that the answer is always lies in partnership. So if there's a constituent who cares a lot about an issue, to partner up with an organization that also works on that issue, and to perhaps work with them to craft a bill. And then of course, working with a legislative champion that also cares, because they're the ones who have to actually file the bill. A constituent can't file a bill on their own. They need a legislative champion who is willing to do that and who's willing to go to bat for that piece of policy. I feel like there was another question that you included in there and I may have missed it.
I think it was about how when many different bills get filed around the same issue, you know, and then the committee will often have a hearing on all of them at once and kind of work with the various sponsors to get the best parts into the sausage that was being, sorry, vegetarians. Okay, are there other questions?
I just was wondering if I'm remembering correctly, the legislators often ask people to help them craft the language. So that's another piece that we could say, here's an idea. Could you get the legislative folks to help out with, I mean, the writer folks? Yes,
right, absolutely. The staff.
Yeah, that happens all the time. A legislator will maybe even think about, I'm blanking on which bill it is. I think it's Senator Comerford's bill around health equity in all levels of government bill, which has a lot to do with just like integrating health equity into like the processes at both like the thinking about the executive the executive branch, but then also thinking about the legislature. And that's something where I think she called the Western Mass Health Equity Network together. And there was like a group of folks from Western Mass who were on a call and they went through what they were thinking for the bill and folks provided feedback. And I think they did that with other groups as well. Some of you may have been included in that. But yeah, that absolutely happens all the time when a legislator has an idea for something, but of course wants feedback from constituents and feedback from the community that it would impact.
Seems to me like something valuable that the CHIP could do would be to kind of come up with a list of some advocacy organizations that work on the kinds of issues that are on our, you know, on our priorities list, so that people know, you know, who might they want to get on the newsletter of or connect with if they want to be a stronger advocate on a particular issue, or if they have an idea that they want to put forward.
Absolutely. And or another option too is just making sure that your legislators are aware of which issues you all care the most about, because then you're going to come to mind when they're thinking about shaping legislation, right? And they're going to know, oh, okay, well, I need to reach out to this CHIP because I know they care about this. And so I know they can give really great feedback around this issue. So yeah, that's a good point, Jen.
So I'm going to share my screen just to show you the legislature's website, and then I'm going to show you what you can do if you make an account on their website. So can you see it? Okay, good. So this is just, you know, what you get if you go to MyLegislature.gov. This is their public facing website. And you can get a lot of information just by going here without signing in or anything. It tells you what's coming up right now. In fact, it tells you that there are 2 live hearings happening right now, and that there's one coming up this week on housing, which I'm interested in. And you can see where we are in the budget process. We're here at the Senate. I think we might have moved forward to the Senate budget phase. But it does give you kind of a sense of where we are. All the bills, the Constitution, it also shows you kind of the things that people are looking for the most. I think this is based on a search, you know, kind of SEO results, the most popular bills right now. I looked at this yesterday and again today, and some things have changed on this list. Has some frequently asked questions here too at the bottom. But you might have noticed that some of the things have these stars next to them. Oh, you also can find out, you can find legislators You can look at who, who's in the Senate, who the clerks are. And at the top, these categories are quite useful too. This is the one that Phoebe shared earlier in the chat that has the list of committees. This is all the hearings and events. So it's the same information as you see on the dashboard. It's just sorted a different way. And a pretty decent search engine, so you can put in a word that you're curious about. But these stars are things that you could mark if you have an account. And then when you log into your account, it will give you information about what's going on with those things that are of interest to you. And supposedly, it will also email you when things come up. So this is up here at the top. I've logged into my account so I can tell that I'm logged in because I have the star on my icon here. And if I click on one of these stars, like you can see that I clicked on the Joint Committee on Housing hearing that's coming up. When I go to my dashboard, it shows me just the things that I've said that I'm interested in. So here's a bill that I said I was interested in. Here are 2 hearings. I think I probably have to switch it over to subscribed to get notifications. Alexis is nodding, so that might be right. You can see that for the Joint Committee on Public Health hearing that's coming up on Monday, there's an agenda that's been posted, and there's a link to all the bills that are going to be discussed at that hearing. And for the Joint Committee on Housing hearing that's tomorrow, there aren't any materials posted yet, so that's not as helpful. You can also decide which legislators you want to follow. So you could find some of those people, like the chairs of committees for topics that you're interested in, and you can have a shortcut to them right here. And you can follow your local legislators, and you can see which committees they're on, which bills they've filed, which bills they've co-sponsored. So if you're like me, you might get quite a lot of emails from people that say, it's really, really, really important that you ask your legislator to co-sponsor this bill right now, or take action on this bill right now. And if you're trying to build a relationship with your legislators, you might want to do a little snooping first to see whether they've already co-sponsored that bill, or and then your communication might be different. It might be more like, I see that you co-sponsored this bill. Thank you. I have a story to share, or can you put me on your list of people who care about this issue? I've done that with a couple of issues that are important to me, and it's really been very helpful. And then I've gotten messages like from Joe Comerford asking me to submit testimony for a hearing. And it isn't hard to make that happen. You can really, it's a pretty small circle here. So if there are things that you care about, it's pretty easy to get to know these folks. And this, I think, is a pretty useful tool for being able to do that. So if you, I think the other thing to know is that this idea of hearing testimony sounds pretty intimidating, but it is not. It doesn't have to be. So you can submit testimony in support of a bill that is like an email. It can be written. You can send it ahead of time. You can send the same testimony in multiple legislative sessions. A bill might get stuck in committee or might never make it to a floor vote. And you might have your thing that you wrote, and you can pull it out and tweak it and send it in again. Hearings do have a limited amount of time for people to speak. And so I think that you shouldn't, when you're thinking about contributing to hearings, you might not be thinking, you might not need to worry too much about the idea of like going to the State House and talking to people in person, but you can still share your story at that hearing by submitting written testimony ahead of time. Usually there's a deadline, and often you're going to send the same letter to all of the people on the committee, and then you'll get a response back. So then you're like in their, you know, you're on their email list, you're on their radar, they know that you're a person who cares about that issue. It can be a very useful way of starting to build an identity as an advocate. So I think that's all I have to say. Phoebe, did you want me to show people anything else?
No, it's the most thing, you know, you establish one of those by just clicking on that little thing that looks like
Little guy up here at the
replaceable
top.
person here, and then you can just set up an account really easily.
Yeah, it's really, you put in your email address. I think if you're concerned about working for a place where there might be limits on lobbying, you might want to use your personal email address. And then, you know, everything that you do from this account is going to be from you as a constituent.
Thank you. So I think you can stop sharing your screen, and I think we're just about out of time. So I'm mostly, well, I wanted to thank Alexis and Jen for showing us that tool, and just really encourage people who haven't done this before to get involved. It is really, it really does work. Like, it just takes patience, and you can engage. I've recently been involved in the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years in this lengthy process where we saw a huge problem in our state around the local public health funding. We're one of the only states in the country that doesn't fund local public health. And so we said, well, what can we do about that? Well, we can start a commission. So we worked with some legislators to write a bill to start a commission. The commission met, it made a report, it made recommendations. We had a bill that was introduced. We worked with legislators to make that, to you know, champions to file that bill. We got co-sponsors. The first bill passed. We got a little tiny bit of money, $500,000 in last year's budget for the whole state. That was great. This year, and as Alexis said, we had a hearing on the next version of the bill, the work on the rest of the recommendations. That didn't go anywhere because there were a bajillion bills that didn't get heard at the last session. But we filed it again this year, you know, and we got another 120 sponsors, and we filed our same testimony again, and we testified on the State House, and we got $10 million in the budget this year, you know, so it does work. It takes a long time, and the relationships, I think that was a really important part of what Alexis said. This can feel like a huge process, and that all you know, you just need to give in your recommendation about something to a specific part of the process, but you get a lot more leverage when you have relationships with people, because they really, really do want to be responsive. And you saw that state reps in particular are only representing a pretty small number of people in the grand scheme of things. And so they should be and feel very available to you. And even the senators aren't representing so many people that you can't be someone they know well and really want to represent. So just want to encourage everybody to get involved. And I think Jen is chatting out, but we will also follow up with the list of recommended priority legislative actions that came out of our meeting in April. For those of you who were there, we made a little grid of what their numbers are. And if anybody was interested in any particular one of those, you can go there, see what the House bill number was or the Senate bill was, and you can star that and follow it. If you want to write down your name that you were interested in being one of the people who's sort of tracking that, we will be circling back as the session goes on to hear from folks about what success they're having or not in moving it along. So I think that's it. And it's 4:30, and we're so grateful for all your time and engagement, and really please do please do get involved with some of these statewide groups like MPHA. They're having their annual breakfast this Friday. I'll be going there to that, but a really great set of people to be connected to. So, and Jen's suggestion of sending out who are some of the other groups working on issues like the people for the Fair Share Amendment or the people for transportation. We'll send those out in our next newsletter as well. So thank you all, and have an amazing afternoon. And Jen and I can hang around here after and see if anyone has any questions. But we can send you back to your days. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thanks, Jen and Phoebe.
Thank you for having
Alexis.
us. Great presentation, Alexis.
Thank you.
Alexis, that was awesome.
Hi, everybody.
They do such good work. Hi, Trisha. Thanks for coming.
Oh my God, that was so great. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I think I came late. Was there how do I get the written material from?
Yes,
Okay.
we will.